Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Atomi Brainwaves, our podcast on education for educators. Brainwaves is produced by our wonderful team here at Atomi. What is Atomi? It's an online teaching and learning platform for secondary education. We provide engaging, curriculum-specific video and text lessons for over 190 subjects, as well as matching quizzes and exam practice that can be used for both learning and formative assessment. We also provide powerful analytics that can help teachers diagnose how their students are progressing and zero in on who might need a little bit of extra help. Our goal is to help make life easier for our teachers, give them more time to work on the most important things, and ultimately help to generate better outcomes. If you want to find out more about Atomi, head over to our main site at getatomi.com and feel free to try it out for free. Today, I got to speak to Tim Connell, a special education consultant with over 20 years' experience. We discussed just what the term special education encompasses, what providing special education looks like in modern classrooms, and dove into the theory and practice involved in Tim's work as a special education consultant. If this sounds good to you, feel free to subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you like to do your podcast listening, and we'll never say no to a quick 5-star review. For now, give this episode a listen, and I hope you enjoy.
Are you going to teach us anything?
What, you want me to teach you something? You want to learn something? All right. You got it!
Hey everybody, welcome back to Atomi Brainwaves. I am your host Simon, and today I'm joined by our very special guest Tim Connell, former specialist behaviour consultant with Department of Education and Training and a special education consultant with over 20 years experience across all sectors. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for getting up so bright and early. Just so the listeners are aware, it's for me here in Dublin, it's a very palatable 7:20 p.m. For you, it's 6:20 a.m. in Sydney. So just want to make sure everybody knows that and is suitably impressed by your early start.
I actually think I work better this time in the morning, so that's fine with me.
Well, it's a dream scenario because I'm definitely more of an evening guy myself. So it's worked out well. So as probably came across in the intro there, the kind of central topic that we're going to be talking about today is sort of your area of expertise, which would be special education. But before we kind of get into that, whenever we have a guest on, we like to start by just getting a run through of your journey in education. So where you started out, and I guess what the different twists and turns along the road were that led you to where you are now. So if you can give us that quick run through.
Sure. Well, I mean, I guess it's been a kind of organic process. There hasn't been a lot of planning involved. But I started with a degree in primary education, and then I did a postgraduate degree in special education and went straight into a school for kids with autism spectrum disorder called Giant Steps in Sydney. And I was there for about 3 years, and then I went to a different kind of class with the Department of Education that no longer exists, but they used to have special classes for students with severe language disorders, receptive and expressive language disorders. I did that for a while, and then I went into a role for 9 years, which was now no longer exists as well. It was an itinerant position supporting students with serious behavioural and emotional disturbance. So in some cases you'd provide consultancy support, and in other cases you would work with that student for up to 10 weeks or longer sometimes. From there I went into state office, the Department of Education, in the Disability Programs Directorate, and quickly realised I wasn't cut out to be a bureaucrat, and I moved back into the private or independent sector and worked for another 6 years as a special ed consultant, providing support to independent and private schools in New South Wales. And then I set up my own consultancy, and for the last 3 years I've been lucky enough to run that consultancy, but also work full-time running a learning support department in a large high school in Sydney, which is just amazingly lucky to be able to do those two things together. I really feel like I have the best of both worlds.
Yeah, fantastic. It's a really interesting journey you've had, and a lot of impressive milestones along the way. And before we kind of get into the nuts and bolts of what I guess the work that you're doing now and the work that you've done over the years involves, I guess I just wanted to ask, did you clearly, as is clear through what you were saying there, is special education has been a real, I guess, vocation for you. Might it be fair to say something that you've followed through the years and through various stages and organisations? And I just wanted to quickly ask, what was it that drew you into that particular sector of education? Rather than as many teachers might have done, go down the different routes. What was it that drew you into pursuing a kind of a long and successful career in special education?
Well, that's a good question. I think it was probably just a gut feeling that was what I was meant to do. When I was doing my primary teaching degree, I never really envisioned myself working as a regular teacher, if you like. I always knew I was going to do postgrad special ed, and that's the course that kind of unfolded. But I don't know whether there was a conscious plan. It was more just an unconscious understanding that was what I enjoyed and that was what I was meant to do, if you like.
Yeah, there you go. And it's certainly, the truth of that has borne itself out in the years that have followed, which you've spoken about. But yeah, very, very much seems the case that it was something that called out to you and drew you in. I guess so. Like I said, the thrust of our focus in this conversation is going to be about, strategies and activities in the classroom and all the rest. But before we got into that, I wanted to start by just getting an actual breakdown from you of the term special education. What exactly it is that means, because I feel like it's something that maybe a lot of people, particularly a lot of people not involved in education themselves or not even involved in special education, might have some degree of understanding about and some sort of assumptions about what the term means, but there might be some misconceptions out there and some misunderstandings that are sort of baked in to the general understanding. So to get the ball rolling, could you give us just a breakdown and definition of the term special education and the scope of what it covers, what it caters to, and what it means in terms of what a school and what a teacher can do?
Yeah, I don't know whether there's a formal definition. I think it's probably changed, and really there would not be any teacher who's not familiar with it, because every teacher is now supporting many students in their classrooms with a range of different needs. Traditionally, I guess special education was defined as educating students with disability, and probably, back in the day when people heard that term, they pictured a special school, whereas now the scope is completely different, and it covers everything from a student who's away from school for medical reasons and needs support, through to students with disabilities like ADHD and autism spectrum disorder, specific learning disorders, right through to students who are really seriously impacted by disability. In Australia, we have legislation called the Disability Standards for Education, and that legislation describes students having a right to access and participate in school on the same basis as a non-disabled peer. So if you take that kind of term, access and participation, then special ed now really is support for any student who's experiencing a barrier to access and participation. And I guess the reality is that that's probably every student at some point in their school career.
Yeah, very true. It's a very good overview there of the term that you provided. But one thing I just picked up on there that I wanted to maybe expand upon a little bit before we move on is there you talked about how the understanding might be a little different when it comes to specialist schools that you mentioned versus, I guess, non-specialist schools, where there's a catering to within that structure for special education alongside, I guess, the more, I don't know, for lack of a better term, traditional structures that maybe the majority of the students exist within. And I just wanted to talk about, what does the term special education mean different things in those two different arenas? You know, within a specialist school, would it mean something else to in, I guess, a mainstream school, if you like?
Yeah, it would. I mean, in a specialist school, we're talking about students who have very serious physical and or intellectual disability, and so the schools themselves look very different in terms of equipment, etc. They're staffed differently, but one of the main changes within the world of special education is the fact that now, as it should be, the vast majority of students with disability are included in mainstream classrooms. So I would hope that that term special education eventually becomes obsolete, and teachers and everyone else just understands that good teaching starts with direct, explicit instruction and mastery learning, and follows a continuum that finishes with the independent generalization of those skills or knowledge. And the only difference is how long different students might spend at different points on that continuum. So I think that there is an understanding now that special education really is every student at different points in their school career, and that special settings, although they still exist and always will, really less and less the kind of place where a student with disability is going to be educated, and the mainstream classroom is more and more where every student with disability, with a few exceptions, should be.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and there's almost sort of an irony in there in what you're talking about, in how, you know, the more the term special education comes to encompass different things, the more obsolete it becomes, because it's including more and more students and recognizing more and more that, you know, as you say, it's something that in a way every student at some point is going to need the assistance of and the use of. And I suppose one thing that's wrapped up a little bit in there might be an element of not taboo, but a sensitivity around the word with regards to certain students, certain schools. That's obviously something I imagine that has changed significantly over the years. Can you speak to a little bit just towards the attitudes of teachers, of schools, of students, and of people in general towards special education and to its place in the classroom, and how maybe that has changed over the years as you've experienced them?
Yeah, look, I think, you know, we use the term special ed, but a special education pedagogy, if you like, is really no different to a mainstream pedagogy. Like I said, it's probably more emphasis on direct, explicit instruction, on, you know, the breaking down of information for students, more repetition, more opportunities to move that information from their short to long-term memory. But the way it's changed, I guess, if I were a parent of a child with disability even 30 years ago in Australia, one, I might not even consider that my child would be educated in a mainstream school, and two, if I were to knock on the door of that school prior to the legislation that now exists, there's every chance that they would say, this is too hard, we can't do it. And that's changed very much. In terms of teacher attitude, I find teachers and school leaders overwhelmingly positive and supportive of students with disability, and on the rare occasion when they're not, it's not a lack of goodwill so much as a wariness of the unknown and a lack of resourcing, a lack of, you know, resourcing to be able to support teachers to support that particular student. But generally, I find teachers and schools incredibly positive, and it's kind of the norm now in Australia, and I know in the US as well. They have very specific legislation over there called IDEA, It's the norm. It's just expected that a student with any sort of issue will be educated in a mainstream classroom. So it's not really there are still occasions where schools might get themselves into trouble by breaching legislation, but usually it's an unconscious thing.
Yeah, well, it's really great to hear, and I guess sort of what I would have expected to hear, but still great to hear that that's the situation with regards to both attitudes, and also the case that we're more so and more so in a world where these are catered to in mainstream schools, and students, whatever difficulties they face, are able to have them catered to within these schools by teachers and by school leaders.
Well, I'm speaking generally. So, I mean, there are plenty of, there are still
course.
plenty of cases that go to go to arbitration where schools get themselves into trouble. And I guess it's important to emphasize too that the attitude is positive, but the level of resourcing that's required to support teachers, to support students with disability, is still an issue.
Of course.
I don't want to create a sort of a utopian picture, but it is certainly broadly very much more positive than it was prior to the legislation that now exists. And that legislation came into place in 2005.
Yes, still an imperfect world, but less imperfect, I guess, than it was in yesteryears. What I want to ask you about next, I suppose, after that look at sort of the broader, bigger picture, is to focus in a little bit on your mission and the work you do in special education. And the first part of that would be a little bit of an exploration of the theory behind your mission. I know one of the things you talk about is this idea of the functional impact of a disability that a student faces, and how providing support at that point of functional impact is really pivotal. And I was hoping you could maybe expand upon this a little bit for us and kind of explain a little more of the theory before we get into the action behind the work you do.
Sure. Yeah, I think to look at issues or barriers to engagement in terms of functional impact and point performance is useful, because it helps teachers and school leaders separate out that issue from the student, and they're less inclined to kind of categorize students under broad terms of different disabilities, and more likely to provide support where it actually needs to be. So functional impact simply means, how does that disability or that issue impact the student in the real world of school? What does it look like when that student is trying to navigate the academic and social landscape of that particular school setting? So for a student with an anxiety disorder, for example, the functional impact for one student might be that he's actually not going to school. He's school refusing. For another student, the functional impact might have to do with the way she interacts with peers, or doesn't interact with peers. I guess the key understanding when we talk about things like functional impact is that the same disability will impact every student differently. And when schools are helped to kind of understand that, support tends to become much more specific and is targeted at what is called the point of performance. So if I'm a student with ADHD, for example, perhaps the point of performance is just beginning a task. For another student with ADHD, it might be quite different. It might be the ability to manage my time effectively.
Okay, yeah, that's really fascinating to kind of pinpoint those different, I guess, areas. I suppose to follow up on that, I mean, bringing it back to what you're talking about in terms of functional impact and that link between the functional impact and the disability, can it be something of a challenge to sometimes establish that link? For instance, if there might be a functional impact happening in the classroom which is impeding a student, but if it's the case, maybe you mentioned anxiety there as an example, if it's a student who is suffering from anxiety, perhaps that's not something that has been properly diagnosed, or that they have made I don't know, their physician aware of, or their parents aware of, or anyone aware of, does a difficulty arise in terms of recognizing that this functional impact is as a result and is connected to a disability, and I suppose what can be done to more easily establish that connection? I know that's a broad question, and obviously it's going to be case specific, but just if you can speak to it generally in terms of pinpointing that connection, what can be done to overcome challenges?
No, I think it's a really good question, and I think the answer is that looking at the issue in terms of functional impact and point of performance actually makes it easier to eventually, if it is the case that we're backward mapping and looking for a reason for why that's happening, then it's a more logical way to do it, because our goal always is to help that student to genuinely engage with the curriculum on the same basis as the student next to them. So we try not to pathologize things, overly, but it would quickly become clear that if a student was struggling with starting a task, for example, when we began to kind of observe and sort of perhaps take some data on that, and even just a simple discussion with the student themselves, whether it was an anxiety issue versus an issue like inattentive ADHD. And in many cases, those two things are not mutually exclusive, and so there'll often be comorbidities. So the times where it's useful to backward map, and it would be unusual for someone like me to be called in if there wasn't already an understanding of what was driving that issue. But in some cases, there's an understanding of what the issue is, but there's not a good treatment plan in place. And so the advantage of having an external person come in sometimes can be to help clarify the idea that we can put in place a number of adjustments within the classroom and the school to support that student, but this issue also needs external support and an external treatment plan that hopefully works closely with the school. So I think functional impact is actually a really useful starting point, and with or without a formal diagnosis, it's the first question that every special educator will ask. What's actually happening for this student? What is it that's making things hard for him? Within the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual that clinicians in Australia use in most cases, there is a caveat for every mental disorder which talks about quality of life. How is it impacting that person's quality of life? And I think that's a really important caveat. And that's kind of what special educators are beginning with. How is his or her quality of life being impacted by this issue? And where do we go from there?
Hey folks, hope you're enjoying the episode so far, and we've got plenty more to come after this quick break. Here at Atomi Brainwaves, we're all about education. And not just for students, for ourselves too. We would love to hear from you, whether that's feedback on one of our episodes or a question you'd like to see answered by one of our guests or by Sue. So, if you've got a comment or a question, don't hesitate to email us at brainwaves@getatomy.com. Looking forward to hearing from you. In the meantime, let's get back to it. Yeah, it sounds like an excellent place to begin to begin providing that help, and just to follow on immediately from that, when you say where do we go from there, ties in nicely to what I want to ask you next, which is a look at special education in action in the classroom. Now again, obviously this is such a broad remit and covers so many things that we'd have to have you talking forever to talk about. I'm sure to have you talking forever to talk about absolutely every instance of special education in the classroom. But I just wanted to, if you could, talk us a little bit through, what teachers can do. Maybe a few examples that you've seen over the years. What teachers, be they in mainstream schools or in specialist schools, and I guess the schools themselves as a broader institution, in providing support to teachers, what they can do in terms of bringing this special education in action to life in the classroom.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, we sort of think of it in three tiers of support, and that first tier is what's called universal support. And the most useful thing that teachers can do there is adopt a framework that considers the need to adjust for every student. And the most well-researched of those frameworks currently is called Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. And UDL takes the universal design principles from architecture and applies them to learning, and says that it makes sense from the outset when we're designing curriculum to consider a range of different ways of presenting information, a range of ways of engaging students, and a range of different ways of assessing their knowledge from the beginning, rather than retrofitting curricula when we get a student with some sort of additional needs. So that would be number one. And then we, assuming that's in place, that we then look at issues that rise above that, and depending on the severity of that issue, we apply an equally intensive level of support. And that process is called response to intervention. So that support might be as simple as very simple adjustments to the classroom environment. It might just be thinking about where that student needs to sit. It'll be different ways of communicating with that student that might include more regular checks for understanding. And in some cases, it might be modification of the curriculum. Not so much changing the content, but perhaps changing the pace with which we move through content, or providing more opportunities for practice to ensure that that student has those foundation concepts at a mastery level. So it really depends. It's an individual process, but what quickly becomes clear is that anything that's beneficial in terms of pedagogy for a student with a mental health issue, with ADHD, with an autism spectrum disorder, with a specific learning disorder, is also helpful for other students. So it's not like we need to be providing a separate pedagogy. In most cases, it is just more of what we're doing, perhaps in a more intensive way, but it should and usually does become a part of that teacher's fluent teaching process.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like definitely a well thought out system and approach to take in situations like that. One thing that came up for me there that I just want to ask you about is, you know, obviously you're talking about the frameworks there that are in place, and then the decisions that have to be made within them. I just wanted to talk to, you know, get from you a little bit of a breakdown of you know, how these decisions might be divided up between, I guess, for lack of a better term, the key stakeholders in any given situation. Because I suppose if you're talking about a student who comes in and who has a disability where decisions need to be made in terms of tweaking the approach, you know, there's the different voices to be considered, I suppose, are, I guess, the teacher, maybe a school leader, obviously the parents, and of course, probably most importantly, the student themselves. So just could you talk to a little bit, and again, you know, as always, must caveat this by saying, of course, case by case it's going to be different, but could you just talk to us a little bit about what that process is like, of, you know, the different voices involved, and how that is dealt with in terms of making decisions about the students' education?
Yeah, look, I mean, it will vary, but in an ideal world, it begins when the parent approaches the school and openly talks about the issue. And then the school will organise some sort of planning meeting that must include parents, part of the legislation, as collaborative partners in the process, as they should be. Most schools will have a learning support head or a learning support teacher who coordinates that support. Obviously, the classroom teacher is involved in that, and the school leader will be involved as well, as will the school counsellor in most cases. Now, the relative input of each of those people will depend on what the issue looks like, and in many cases, an issue may not become apparent until the student's been at the school for a period of time. But in an ideal world, that planning happens before they even begin. And it happens, again, at key transition points. It's regularly reviewed. Students, usually depending on the level of support and the tier of support they're at, will have some sort of individualised plan, and that will be reviewed on a regular basis. And in many cases, particularly in cases where the issues are more serious, or perhaps the relationship between the family and the school is broken down, which is not uncommon with students with disability, then an external consultant will be part of that process as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and that actually kind of you've almost sort of preempted what I was going to ask you next a little bit, because one thing I just wanted to ask was, obviously in an ideal world, and I'm sure this is the case for many students, it is the case that this framework that you're talking about and these decisions are made and a strategy is adopted, and that provides the right solution and helps that student navigate their way through their educational path in a very functional, happy way. But as I said earlier, we live in an imperfect world, and I'm sure there are plenty of students for whom, despite the best of intentions and everyone doing everything right, more and more challenges and difficulties continue to arise, and things, just setting a path that works seems to become extremely difficult. And I just wanted to ask, and again, you can refer to students you've encountered yourself, or just in terms of generalities, but in that kind of scenario, what can teachers and school leaders do, and what kind of support and resources are available to them to help a student for whom nothing seems to be working, get on the right path and overcome this challenge?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think what tends to happen when schools say nothing's working is that when you really break it down, there is progress being made, but the progress is not being made at the pace they'd hoped. It's so incremental that it doesn't feel like there's any progress being made. And so if it were an issue, for example, with a student with some serious behavioural issues, we'd be looking for a reduction in the frequency of those issues, the intensity of them, and the duration of them. And if we were to break that down, if teachers have implemented good classroom management processes as a result of talking to a consultant or just doing their own research, it would be very rare that some progress wouldn't have been made, but it may not feel like it. In other cases, I think it's useful just to kind of wipe the board clean and go back to that planning process and think about the domains of academic functioning and social functioning and behavioural functioning, and perhaps rewrite the goals. Maybe it was the case that the goals that were originally written weren't realistic, and that's why we're not achieving them. In terms of resourcing, I think that there are a number of things that can be done there, but one of the issues within special education is that the default resource tends to be a teacher aide, a school learning support person, which is not always the most useful form of support. That or withdrawal from the classroom, which again is not always the most useful form of support. A far more useful form of support, in my experience, is to give teachers some additional time to do their own research and professional learning, to really better understand that disability and be clear about what it is that they can do within their classroom. In other cases, it might be consulting with an external professional, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a speech therapist, to review what's happening for that student. In many cases, it will also be having an external person work with the family to better understand the family dynamic and how that might be impacting the student as well. So there are a number of things that can be done, but usually it's a process of one, asking the question, are we really not making progress? And if so, why, and which of those external things can be in place? And if we are making progress, how can we make those increments larger? How can we continue to improve in a faster way?
Yeah, it certainly makes a lot of sense to take that approach about, I guess, making sure you have the right approach and the right goals and aims in mind, and utilizing the right resources. One more thing I wanted to ask you about in terms of special education and action in the classroom. I guess we've touched on a few different variables there. This idea of varying levels of students encountering difficulty. One variable that obviously is always in play in schools is this idea of age and stage, and students. Obviously there's going to be a classroom of 5-year-olds looks very different from a classroom of 17-year-olds. Under the umbrella of special education, I just wanted to ask, in terms of providing special education, teachers, be they specialist teachers or teachers in mainstream schools, providing that special education support, how that looks different, and what different things it maybe asks of teachers for much younger students through the middle years and all the way up to the later teenage end of the spectrum. What are, I guess, the general differences between those different stages in terms of what the teachers are doing?
Well, the obvious difference is between high school and primary school is that that student in high school is now having to navigate 7 periods a day and 7 different teacher personalities. There's a whole lot more transition in there. But it really depends on the disability and how that individual student is impacted. So what's different in primary school is that it's one teacher and then probably a number of extra subject teachers who are implementing adjustments. And in a high school, it's 7 different teachers who are implementing adjustments and supporting that student. It is also understanding really clearly what the landscape looks like and how that's different for a 5-year-old to a 17-year-old. Now, obviously, the social landscape for a 5-year-old is quite different. The academic landscape for a 5-year-old is quite different. The behavioural landscape's different to what it is for a 17-year-old. So the starting point, I guess, is looking at where that student, the context that that student is functioning in. How do we maximise their independence within that context, and what support needs to happen, and the actual form that support takes would be quite different. And it's not just a function of chronological age, it's a function of the developmental stage that they're at, because in many cases schools are working with students who have developmental disabilities, which by definition means that it's not so much that I won't hit those same developmental milestones. It may be the case that I hit them slightly later than the rest of my peers. But that needs to be taken into account as well.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense, and I suppose knowing, it sounds like one of the key elements is, I guess, teachers coming into the room with these understandings already in place about the different contexts of play that you touched on, behavioural, etc., and also the developmental stage at which the students are at. So certainly it makes a lot of sense there. The last key thing I wanted to touch on with you, Tim, I suppose, is zeroing in on specifically your role as a special education consultant, and sort of, because we've talked about mainly teachers in the classroom and what they can do, but I just wanted to just get a bit of a sense from you of what is involved in the day-to-day for a special education consultant in dealing with schools and teachers and providing that support and training for them, what that looks like, the challenges that come up within that. So if you could just give us a breakdown, I guess, of what that role is like.
Yeah, that's fine. I think before we do that, Simon, I just want to jump back and kind of state the obvious, which is that irrespective of the age of the student, just as it is with every other student, the key to successful support is the quality of the relationship that teachers have with that student. And most students who've experienced some sort of barrier in their school life will be able to name a teacher who turned things around for them, or who connected with them in a really meaningful way. So I wouldn't want to leave that out of the equation, because it's probably the most important thing. In terms of my role as a consultant, then look, I guess my role is to help schools to clarify the issues, because it's really easy when you're in a school or when you've been immersed in an issue for a period of time to lose a sense of objectivity, because you're just so caught up in it, and you're in the school, and it's hard sometimes to step outside of that bubble. So my role in the first instance is to help clarify issues, and then having done that, it's often, I guess, to act as a sort of a translator between what the research says about this issue and what this individual student needs. And so I always make the point as a consultant that I don't presume to know what the landscape of your school looks like, nor would I presume to understand the dynamic of your classroom. My job is to kind of help you define the issue, the functional impact, the point of performance, and then to talk to what the evidence says is best practice for this issue, and then work with you to apply it to this individual student, because it's going to look different for each student. And often to coordinate that support between the external professionals and the school as well, as part of my role as a consultant. And in increasingly common cases, it's to provide some sort of mediation between the school and a family, because, as I said before, it's not uncommon for relationships to break down or to hit a bit of a roadblock at different points. And usually that just needs or benefits from someone coming in and clarifying the fact that we actually all have the same goal, which is that this student is able to access and participate on the same basis to realize their potential, but that it's also entirely valid for the teacher to be tired and exhausted by this process, and for school leaders to feel under pressure because maybe other parents are beginning to complain, etc. So it's sometimes part of a consultant's role to sort of acknowledge all of those different pressures and to help each of those stakeholders understand what it looks and feels like for the other person, and to then rebuild that relationship, and then to kind of move forward with that common goal, which is always, in the best outcome for the student.
Yeah, amazing. That's a really really interesting insight into that role and what it encompasses. And I suppose just one last follow on from that, which is something that regular listeners will know is popping up as something asked about in nearly every episode at the moment, is this idea of the situation we're in with regards to the pandemic, and how that has, obviously it's affected every walk of life. Education is no different, and specific areas of education are no different. But I suppose within, I guess, first this idea of your work as a special education consultant, but even then, if you could speak a little bit to beyond that in terms of the impact upon special education in the classroom and the availability of special education resources. What is the impact that this pandemic has had, and I guess what are the different ways you yourself and maybe other individuals within the special education world themselves have been dealing with it? What are the responses that they've been able to muster to the unique challenges of this situation?
Yeah, look, I guess it probably depends on the country that you're in. In Australia, we've been lucky in that schools are now back operating normally, albeit with some social distancing protocols, but generally we're operating normally. So we had a relatively short lockdown period, and for people like me, particularly, if I think about my role as a consultant, there were probably a lot of positives to come from it, and the top of that list would be the fact that schools became more comfortable with the idea of video conferencing, and they became more fluent with that technology. And that, for me, opened up the world, which means now I work with schools, in different countries just as fluently as I would here. So that's been a positive. For students with disability, there were a lot of positives as well, and some of them were quite unexpected. So it was quite common for me to hear students with ADHD, for example, describing the fact that they actually like being online because they're able to focus better. Their selective attention improved because they don't have the distraction of their friend sitting next to them and the noise, movement and transitions that are part of a school day. Now, the flip side for those students is that their ability to manage their own time and be self-directed is not always as good as it should be. So there were some negatives there as well. For students with issues that have kept them away from school, students whose school refused, students who have serious mental health issues, medical issues, we now have a medium to use to keep them connected to school, even when they're not physically on site. So there are a whole bunch of positives there. And there were obvious challenges as well, and probably the biggest of those challenges was that students with additional needs or students who are experiencing some sort of barrier generally benefit even more from what researchers call teacher immediacy, that the fact that the teacher's physically present and that there are a whole lot of non-verbal behaviours that go along with verbal behaviours that help to engage them in a lesson. And that's hard to replicate using video technology, which is why we had issues like Zoom fatigue. Talking to someone, interacting with someone via video is more cognitively effortful, chew through more glycogen, if you like. And so there were positives and negatives. Most schools and my sort of counterparts running learning support departments in different schools all had their own ways of managing things, but in general they were able to replicate what they were doing on the school site using video technology, but they may have shortened the time that they spent online with students, understanding the fact that it's cognitively effortful. And they continued to provide support to teachers, and the difference would be that the types of adjustments they were suggesting would relate to how teachers can work with students via video rather than in the classroom. So there were probably more positives to come out of it than negatives, I think. I was just so impressed with the resilience of kids generally, in that lockdown period, and also with the way teachers stepped up and kind of, not every teacher is fluent with technology. That's a scary thing for many. And the way teachers generally in this country, and I'm sure around the world, stepped up and so quickly adapted to that new way of working and did it really well and continue to do it really well, particularly in countries that are still in lockdown.
Well, yeah, there you go. I mean, very positive to hear, I guess, you putting... Sorry, a positive spin sells it short because it's not a positive spin, it's a positive truth. Obviously you've acknowledged the negatives there, and of course they are there, but very encouraging to hear that there are a lot of positives that have come in your own experience within the world of special education and in the world of education at large, with what you're talking to there about teachers.
Yeah, I think it also made for students who are disengaged, which is a kind of a broad term, it helped them to realise that there are actually a lot of things about school that I like and miss, and perhaps to be more appreciative of those things when they return to school. I think also parents in many cases appreciated the work teachers do, having had to do that same work, particularly with younger kids themselves. I think they were kind of a little more appreciative of just how tricky it can be for a teacher to engage a group of 25 kids for a day, every day.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot asked of parents, I suppose, in that instance, which is drawing their attention to the difficulties teachers face. But, a lot asked of teachers, a lot asked of students, a lot asked of individuals who work in the special education area, and it's very heartwarming to hear that, by and large, by the sounds of things, these individuals have risen to the occasion and learned new things and gleaned new positives from what is a very difficult situation. So a positive note to end our main chat on. However, you're not quite off the hook yet. We always like to finish when we have a guest by getting a hot tip. So this can be a fun piece of advice. Maybe it's a quick anecdote from your years in education. It can be jokey. It can be not that serious. If you want, it can be deadly serious. But whatever way you want to skin it, Tim, what is your hot tip for the day?
Well, look, I don't know whether it's so much a hot tip. I mean, there are probably hundreds of different anecdotes, but there's an incident that has always stood out for me that happened many years ago when I was a consultant with the Department of Education, and I was working with a boy in Year 6, which is the end of our primary school, and he had really serious combined type ADHD, which means he has the hyperactive and the inattentive component, and he also had Tourette's disorder, so he couldn't tolerate stimulant medication, so it made his tics worse. And most days his teacher, by around 10 o'clock, would have to ask him to go and take a break because it was just too much for everyone else to have him in the room, and it was too much for him as well, frankly. And so he would go to the principal, who, like the classroom teacher, was a very kind, patient, and caring person. And on this particular day, I arrived at the school, and it was a little bit after 10, and he was already in the principal's office. And I walked in, and he was kind of bouncing off the walls, which is what he invariably did by that time of day. And the principal, very much out of character, said to him in a sort of a firm tone, "Robbie, can you just stop?" And he did stop, and he turned back to her and sort of yelled at her, "Do you think I like being like this?" And it was a kind of one of those, I guess, light bulb moments where she and I kind of stopped and realized that for him and for so many kids that we work with, it's not a choice. It's particularly with issues like ADHD or behavior. We kind of think that students making a deliberate choice to do this, to behave this way, therefore we need to apply this punitive process and that will modify their behavior. When you kind of ask yourself the sensible question, which is why? Or why would a student want to be in trouble all the time? Why would a student want to be in a situation where their peers find it hard to be sitting next to them? It's not a choice. It's something that is genuinely beyond their control. And when we view it that way, we start to write programs differently. 90% of effective programming for a student with any sort of issue happens before the issue arises. It talks about the things that are in place before that issue actually occurs, rather than the other way around, how we're going to react to it, how we're going to respond to it. So that was a light bulb moment for me. That was a kind of an epiphany within special education that I still think about occasionally when I look at different students.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's a really powerful point and a really beautiful example to illustrate it. So thank you for sharing that with us, and thank you so much for coming on and for speaking with us and for sharing your expertise, Tim. It's been an absolute pleasure.
My pleasure too. Thank you, Simon.
Awesome. To everybody listening, if you want to check out more episodes, you can find them on whatever platform you're listening to this on. If you want to check us out in our main site, you can find us at getatomy.com. For the time being, it's going to be goodbye from Tim and goodbye from me. See ya.